Here we go. Many articles to cover today, January 25th. Starting with Michael Kaufman, Putin's wager in Russia's standoff with the West. A large war in Europe is likely in the coming weeks. The current security architecture of the continent, the future of Nato, and America's role in shaping security outcomes there are all at stake. Beyond Europe, this conflict would have profound implications for U.S. defense strategy and may upset America's best laid plans to focus on the eroding military balance with China. Ukraine, whose fate hangs in the balance, may be at the center of the crisis, but Moscow has a greater goal in mind, the revision of Europe's security order. Oops, sorry about that. The Russian armed forces have conducted a substantial buildup around Ukraine, with Moscow threatening unilateral military measures if it's not able to achieve its goals at the negotiating table. President Vladimir Putin has been coy, but the threat is use of force on a large scale against Ukraine, including the possibility of regime change. Even if force does not get Moscow any closer to the wide-reaching consensus that it seeks from the West, Russia's leadership likely judges that it will secure its influence in the country, deny Ukraine any hope of getting into NATO, and end NATO's defense cooperation with Ukraine. Sorry, just give me a minute. The unfolding events of the past year and the crescendo of the current crisis have been widely interpreted as a classic case of coercive diplomacy. Threats, signals, and demands backed by a show of capability and resolve. However, it's more likely that Moscow is leaning toward a military solution. Russia's diplomatic overture offered few prospects for success at the negotiating table. There's an eerie calm as Russian forces continue to position equipment and units around Ukraine. At this stage, Russia's military retains operational surprise and could launch an assault on short notice. Prediction is always a fraught business, but it seems plausible that Russian forces would seize Ukraine's eastern regions, as well as the southern port city of Odessa, and encircle Kiev. The Russian goal would be regime change, perhaps via constitutional reform, and a settlement that would secure Russian influence over Ukraine. From a position of leverage, Russia would try to attain a U.S. commitment to give it a free hand in this part of Eastern Europe. You remember a few live streams ago, we read Curtis Yarvin's argument about giving Putin a free hand in Europe. With Belarus firmly in Russia's orbit, Moscow is eyeing using force to change Ukraine's strategic orientation in an effort to create its own cordon against Western influence. An expanded invasion of Ukraine may not herald a prolonged occupation, but Russia appears prepared for this contingency. Russian force posture can enable a range of choices, but it's difficult to see how Moscow accomplishes any lasting political gains without having to resort to maximalist options. How to interpret Russian demands. This crisis is not about NATO or Ukraine, but about NATO and Ukraine. Russia wants Washington to agree to a revised European order in which Russia has a veto over security arrangements and in decisions over security outcomes. By closing NATO's open door and halting defense cooperation with non-members, Washington would be acknowledging that Moscow's security considerations supersede the right of its neighbors to choose their strategic orientation, and that security in Europe must be negotiated with Moscow. Yet, Russian demands for legally binding guarantees raise questions. On the one hand, Putin has railed against successive rounds of NATO expansion, encroaching military infrastructure, military exercises, and defense cooperation with countries like Ukraine. But he's also said that he does not believe in U.S. security assurances, and according to him, Washington easily withdraws from treaties with or without explanation. So why pursue such agreements with urgency when he believes that Washington may just bin them one day anyway? There's also the nagging problem that no U.S. Congress or any legislature in Europe is likely to ratify a legally binding agreement with Russia based on such demands. Perhaps Moscow still assesses that the United States and its European allies might sign politically binding agreements that fall short of a treaty. While not legally binding, such agreements would hold strategic implications for European countries that are not NATO members. Those states would find their room for maneuver shrinking and would seek to hedge or pursue a foreign policy that includes balancing relations between Europe and Russia. Russia's demands for a halt to NATO expansion, a rollback of defense cooperation with non-NATO members, and a return to a force posture prior to 1997, essentially a go back to Germany clause, seem to have little relationship to the deadlock over Minsk II implementation. These demands won't secure a say over Ukraine's domestic policy or even get Russia out of the current sanctions regime. Furthermore, why didn't Moscow make any of these demands during the spring buildup? The timing was no less auspicious. Why wait until the end of 2021 to come up with rushed proposals and demand rapid progress? Okay, the thesis so far, Moscow is prepared to act maximally. The diplomatic effort appears improvised, while the central demands were obvious non-starters for the West. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, often the last to know what is happening, was unsurprisingly surprised to find out it was supposed to be coming up with these draft treaties in late December. Moscow has not only been asking for things that it knows it can't attain, but it has been doing so in a manner that will ensure that it cannot attain them. Serious negotiations are usually done behind closed doors. By publicizing its demands and refusing to unbundle them in ways that might achieve compromise, Russia has made its diplomatic effort appear more performative than genuine. Again, main thesis here, Moscow not primarily interested in a diplomatic resolution. They're gunning for the maximalist option. Perhaps Moscow's just fishing for what it can get, but the political demands do not align with the military side of the equation. Settling for minor modifications to the already existing strategic stability agenda would appear to be a political retreat after releasing such ostentatious demands. Okay, Russia has set the context for, to repeat, the major thesis so far: aggressive, maximalist military action. Persistent references to internal time constraints, demanding answers urgently, suggest that Putin has been leaning towards using force all along. At Geneva, it became clear that Moscow views U.S. counter-offers for an expanded strategic stability agenda with much lower significance than its irreconcilable demands. A dramatic expansion of the war is now the most probable outcome. In the spring, the Russian leadership issued red lines, but if they were really interested in deterring an expansion of U.S. defense cooperation, then such a demand would have been made at the June presidential summit. So again, performative demands. They would have given the effort a bit longer than a few months to produce results. Putin may see diplomacy as a last-ditch effort to avert war, but Russia's posture suggests he's leaning towards a unilateral solution: maximalist military action. While some commentators may view this as a bluff, it's hard to see how Putin imagined bluffing his way into a wholesale revision of Europe's security architecture. Let me pause for a minute, let you know what it is that we're reading. This is January 24th, 2022. Thanks to the person who sent this to me by Twitter. Putin's wager in Russia's standoff with the West. Commentary by Michael Kaufman in warontherocks.com. And you see the major thesis so far: Putin's diplomatic efforts are performative. What he's really aiming at here is maximalist military action. So let's pick up where we left off. Why now? There are two overlapping issues. The first is Ukraine, where Russia desires to have a firm say over its foreign policy, as well as aspects of its internal governance. The second is to block further NATO expansion and to roll back Ukrainian defense cooperation with NATO members. Moscow perceives its strategy in Ukraine as having generally failed, with diplomacy over the Minsk ceasefire agreement at a deadlock, while Ukraine is increasingly treated as a de facto NATO member. In statements, essays, and articles, Russian leaders have made it clear over the course of 2021 that they believe that Ukraine and its territory are being used as an instrument against Russia by the United States, and if they cannot compel a policy reversal, they will seek military solutions. As Putin said in December, quote, "If our Western colleagues continue their obviously aggressive line, we will take appropriate military technical reciprocal measures and will have a tough response to their unfriendly steps," unquote. What is remarkable about this crisis is how well it has been signposted. Over the course of 2021, with Russian political statements and military activity in close alignment. Although the crisis has structural roots in the post-Cold War settlement, the proximate cause of this standoff is a series of political turns in 2020 and early 2021. After initially being open to dialogue, Ukrainian President Zelensky's administration took a hard turn away from pursuing compromises with Moscow. Zelensky arrested Putin's ally Medvedchuk and banned 3 pro-Russian television channels in the country. Putin has also railed against the discriminatory language law passed in 2019, which has just entered into force. Not only has Ukraine continued on a westward trajectory, but Zelensky has also chosen to take a hard line and has begun to actively eliminate Russian influence in Ukraine. This turnabout dashed any hopes that Russia had of achieving a desirable political settlement and removed the path for Russia to get out from under Western sanctions. Russian officials have publicly made clear that they see no further point to negotiating with Zelensky, viewing his administration as a marionette of the United States, and have instead approached his patron, Washington. Remember, he said earlier in the article, this is about Russia and NATO and Ukraine. It's not an either or. Putin gunning for maximalist military results and for a reconfiguration of the status quo with Ukraine. European capitals and Washington have backed Ukraine's position. Moscow is thus faced with a choice between accepting that Ukraine is slipping away or escalation. Moscow judges that it has to act in order to prevent the fixed reorientation of the country and the destruction of the key pillars of its influence. Among Putin's grievances is the belief that Ukraine will become a platform for U.S. power projection along Russia's southwestern flank, and he cannot tolerate this prospect, recalling Moscow's fears that led it to invade Afghanistan. Hello to those of you who are here or who are watching this after the fact. Appreciate your time and attention. Last fall, he remarked, quote, "What if tomorrow there are missiles near Kharkov? What should we do then? We do not go there with our missiles, but missiles are being brought to our doorstep. Of course, we have a problem here," unquote. Whether genuine or instrumental, Russia's leadership have often used this threat to link Ukraine to broader grievances on European security. Washington's effort, I guess I should just let me make sure I don't lose my spot. Very quickly, those of you who are just tuning in, Putin's wager in Russia's standoff with the West, January 24th, Michael Kaufman in warontherocks.com. That's what we're looking at. I have a bunch of articles I want to go over with you today. Hope you find them interesting and worth your while. Washington's effort to launch a strategic stability dialogue has also played a role. The Biden administration sought predictability in the relationship, perhaps so it could focus on China and pressing domestic concerns. The administration was right to launch this initiative and see if Moscow was willing to engage, but as Oscar Wilde quipped, there are only 2 tragedies in life. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it. Moscow has now made clear what the price of predictability in relations is, and it's clearly one that the United States is unwilling to pay. Given that Washington has signaled that it sees Europe as a secondary theater, the price Russia would ask was inevitably going to be high. By the way, I haven't gone over to the chat yet. I'll do that shortly. I want to get through the article first. Russia's elite may believe that they're in good position to conduct a military operation and weather the storm of economic punishment, Western economic punishment, something we've had occasion to discuss in recent live streams. Having stabilized the Russian economy, established a war chest of reserves over $620 billion, and tightened the screws on its opposition, the regime is more confident economically and politically. Moscow has greater leverage over Europe due to surging gas prices and energy supply shortages. You probably saw some news today about U.S. commitments to supply European allies with energy if they have to sanction Russia and get cut off from that flow. We'll probably look at some articles about that shortly. Putin might also judge that the Biden administration is reticent about enacting the most severe financial sanctions in its arsenal because these would cause ripples in the global financial systems, a rise in U.S. gas prices, not to mention the impact on energy prices in Europe. It also merits considering that Russian assumptions may be colored by war optimism. Moscow might believe that much of the Ukrainian public quietly holds pro-Russian attitudes, and Russian forces might be greeted as liberators. Russian elites see Ukraine as a manipulable oligarchy with corrupt elites. Such assumptions and narratives run deep in Putin's statements and writings. The Russian elite is deeply chauvinistic and has little regard for Ukrainian military capabilities. Moscow may judge the use of force to be preferable relative to the mounting costs of inaction and the potential risks of having to use force later. Leaders talk themselves into war, imagining that the situation is imposed on them and rationalizing that a conflict is inevitable, so it's better to fight now than later. Russia would not be the first country to invade another, misjudging the socio-political dynamics and the costs of occupation. Can Putin back down? So remember, the key thesis so far is that Putin has not blundered into this situation. It's calculated, and he's going to be gunning for the most he can get. The United States and its allies have made clear that while they're willing to discuss an expanded strategic stability agenda, they will not shut down NATO's open door, constrain military cooperation with non-member states, remove military forces and infrastructure from the territory of NATO members who have joined since 1997, or compel Ukraine to accept a form of neutrality. All Russian demands, all non-starters for the United States. While a discussion on future missile placement, mutual reductions in military activity, and other measures might count as a diplomatic success for Moscow, it's unlikely this is enough to satisfy Putin. If it were, why has he not pocketed the deal already? After the meeting in Geneva, the United States was unable to determine if the Russian diplomatic effort was genuine or cover for a planned military operation. The head of Russia's delegation didn't appear to know either. It's doubtful that the Russian leadership can back down without external and internal audience costs. Over the past month, the West has been arming Ukraine in anticipation of a Russian attack, hardly a policy success for Moscow. If Putin backs down with nothing, the domestic and international perception will be that he was bluffing, or worse, successfully deterred. Putin will end up with the worst of both worlds, seen as simultaneously aggressive, because he was blustering, and resistible, because he backed down. Also, while an authoritarian state may care less about domestic audience perceptions, the elites or so-called selectorate are another matter. Authoritarian leaders like Putin can find their ability to manage political coalitions diminished if elites perceive them as reckless, incompetent, and increasingly unfit to rule. The idea there about audience costs from political science, that your actions signal to your electorate. So he's saying, well, do audience costs really matter in authoritarian countries? And here the answer is that they matter not so much for the electorate as for the selectorate. So when you go to this article later, if you do, you can click through those links for the underlying political science argumentation. A more dangerous mobilization. While the military deployment may appear overly visible, lacking in initiative or surprise, in fact, the opposite is true. Russia is indeed assembling this force in a manner designed to conceal its operational aims. To some extent, it retains surprise and initiative. The Russian military is deploying a large force, slowly and deliberately, with equipment that can be parked in the field for months. Troops can be quickly sent to these encampments, fall in on equipment, and begin dispersing. This conceals the final disposition of forces and the timing and scope of an operation. With large numbers of Russian forces having arrived in Belarus and more on the way, a large-scale military operation in the coming weeks seems probable. Ukraine finds itself in a mobilization trap. Kiev might be reluctant to conduct large force shifts. If Moscow is spoiling for a fight, then a mobilization order could be used as a pretext by the Russian leadership, claiming that Ukraine intends to retake the Donbass by force. It's also expensive and economically disruptive. Yet, on the brink of all-out war, the calm among Ukrainian elites is jarring. If you've seen any of their statements, you may have had that experience yourself. Rumors swirl that Zelensky thinks this is a bluff and even believes that the United States is exaggerating the threat intentionally to force him into concessions. Ukraine's leadership appears to be more worried about the impact that this threat has on the economy and public sentiment than about preparing the nation for war. I think you may have seen the tweet or the comment or the post, wherever he made it, by Zelensky that Kiev is safer than Los Angeles. Since 2014, the Russian military has shifted formations to Ukraine's borders, resulting in roughly 55,000 to 60,000 ground troops permanently stationed in the region. The forces normally stationed on Ukraine's border can generate about 25 to 30 battalion tactical groups. So now we're into the weeds of exactly the sizes and the distances of the region here and of the groups at play. So the forces normally stationed on Ukraine's border can generate about 25 to 30 battalion tactical groups. And the forces that have been mobilized in recent months to join them represent another 35 to 40 battalion tactical groups. Recently arrived forces from the Eastern Military District might bring this figure to a total of 65 to 70. So, quite above the normal. A battalion tactical group is a task-organized combined arms maneuver formation averaging 800 personnel per unit, though it can be as small as 600 and as large as 1,000. It's essentially a battalion plus enablers such as artillery, logistics, and air defense. These formations are an imprecise but useful unit of measurement when talking about Russian offensive maneuver potential. Total estimates of end strength is therefore already north of 90,000 personnel. These figures do not include air power, naval units, or additional logistical components that are likely to support this force. Russian-led forces in Ukraine's Donbass region might account for another 15,000 troops, but they have considerably lower combat effectiveness than Russian regulars. The force gathered from other Russian regions, again, just for those of you who are tuning in, I'll tell you in a minute what it is that we're reading. The major thesis of the article so far is that Putin is going to be gunning for maximal military gains, that he's not interested in backing down, and that his diplomatic gestures were performative rather than genuine. The force gathered from other Russian regions largely consists of prepositioned equipment, but is already sufficient for a military operation. There are indications that Russia has begun sending personnel. The current force is largely within the self-deployment range, which means they can move to the border in a matter of days once personnel arrive. Russia retains considerable force generation potential and can surge units to the area on a relatively short notice. Publicly available estimates suggest Moscow might gather a force of 90 to 100 battalion tactical groups, together with reserves and auxiliary forces, for a total of 150,000 to 175,000 troops. The Russian military is not yet in a position for such a large-scale operation, but it could have the requisite forces and elements placed in the coming weeks. Okay, next section, what are Russia's options? Just giving credit where it's due, we're reading Michael Kaufman's Putin's Wager in Russia's Standoff with the West, published warontherocks.com, January 24th, 2022. In other words, yesterday. Where are we? Yeah. A Russian military campaign could range from standoff strikes to a large-scale invasion of Ukraine's eastern regions, the encirclement of Kiev, and the taking of Odessa along the coast. The question is not what Russia can do militarily in Ukraine, since the answer is almost anything, but what kind of operation might attain lasting political gains. Consequently, most scenarios seem illogical and politically counterproductive. Given the stakes and likely costs, any Russian military effort would have to attain political gains that give Moscow the ability to enforce implementation. In short, just hurting Ukraine is not enough to achieve anything that Russia wants. While some believe that Russia intends to compel Ukraine into a new Minsk-like agreement, the reality is that nobody in Moscow thinks that a Ukrainian government can be made to implement any document they sign. Such a settlement would be political suicide for the Zelensky administration or any other. Russia has no way to enforce compliance with its preferences once the operation is over. This is at least the lesson that Moscow seems to have taken from Minsk I and Minsk II. Why would Minsk III prove any different? Russia has not struggled in getting Ukraine to sign deals at gunpoint, but all of these have resulted in Ukraine's continued westward march and a decline of Russian influence in the country. It's not clear, therefore, how Moscow achieves its goals without conducting regime change or a partitioning of the state and committing to some form of occupation to retain leverage. Those who think that Russia might simply conduct an airstrike campaign have an even bigger problem in explaining what possible political aims Moscow could attain via this type of operation. So he's going over the various alternatives, showing that for Russia, it's too low reward for too high risk. In defense of his thesis, as I'm characterizing it, that Putin's gunning for maximal military wins. Most likely, the initial war effort will involve the use of artillery, precision fires, and air power. Then ground forces would conduct a multi-axis attack from Belarus, Russia, the Donbass, and Crimea. A ground operation would entail the occupation of Ukrainian territory for some time to secure lines of communication and critical infrastructure, which requires follow-on forces and potentially reserves. The Russian military has been developing a sizable reserve and conducting partial call-ups to test it. Russia could leverage the offer of an eventual withdrawal from Ukraine in exchange for a deal, figuring that the United States might prefer a broken Ukraine to a hard redrawing of the map of Europe. But this arrangement would undoubtedly combine current demands made to NATO with sovereignty impositions on Ukraine, including federalization to increase regional autonomy and a rollback of defense ties with NATO members, along with promises that NATO will never admit Ukraine. It's possible Putin believes he can get such a deal to be enforced externally by the United States, but only if he holds the bulk of Ukraine's territory in his hands. The increasingly likely scenario is that Moscow intends to install a pro-Russian government backed by its forces, which aligns with recently released claims by the United Kingdom. Some of you may have seen that article. Alternatively, Russia may consider a partitioning of Ukraine. This would not be a total, not just that article, but all of the articles written on the claims by the UK that Russia is seeking to install a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. Alternatively, Russia may consider a partitioning of Ukraine. This would not be a total occupation of the country, but would include most of the country minus the western regions. It would be terribly risky and costly, but would make Putin the Russian leader who restored much of historical Russia and established a new buffer against NATO. A de facto occupation of most of Ukraine may be the only way that Russia can impose its will on the country if it cannot install a pro-Russian government. In launching an offensive, one of Moscow's riskiest decisions will be whether to stay largely east or to venture west of the Dnieper River. Whether Russia intends to partition Ukraine or not, war is highly contingent. Russian forces may end up controlling large parts of Ukraine for a prolonged period either way. Indeed, this is how Russia originally ended up with the Donbass in the first place, having never sought to hold it indefinitely. Similarly, the Russian operation to seize Crimea shows little evidence that annexation was a premeditated outcome. Consequently, once an operation is launched, beyond the initial move, it's difficult to predict how it might end. Why not something lesser in scope, author asks. A smaller campaign, perhaps seizing the rest of the Donbass, would have high costs and risks. What does this gain Moscow and Ukraine, or in terms of revising its position in Europe? If anything, it worsens Russia's current predicament. Russian leaders have acknowledged that their strategy of trying to leverage the Donbass has failed to deliver and are unlikely to double down or repeat something they concede won't work. We read an article yesterday by the same author from 2017 looking at the successes and failures and lessons from Crimea and Donbass. Here you see them applied. The logic of a Russian military operation suggests that the best way in which Moscow could attain lasting political gains is to use force on a large scale and commit to an occupation for some period of time. Maximalist military win. The unfinished business of Europe. If Putin's aim is to see what he can get, he may well take the low-hanging fruit of an expanded strategic stability agenda, pocket the win and close out this gambit. Europeans would breathe a sigh of relief, and US-Russia relations would stagger on until the next crisis. This, though, looks terribly unlikely. Alternatively, if Russia uses force on a large scale, Washington would have to make major shifts in force posture, reinforce deterrence on NATO's flanks, and reinvest in its ability to defend European allies, likely to the detriment of its aim to focus on the Indo-Pacific. The ensuing cycle of sanctions, diplomatic expulsions, and various forms of retaliation might escalate to the use of larger scale economic and political instruments. Those of you who are here, thanks for being here. We're making our way to the end of this article. If Ukraine is unfinished business for Russia's leader, then European security should be unfinished business for the United States. This is a defining moment. Russia may be able to temporarily set the agenda, but it has thus far not shown itself strong enough to make the United States and its allies in Europe restructure the current order to accommodate Russian preferences. There are fundamental disagreements and outlooks on international relations and which principles should govern them. Despite periods of cooperation, Moscow has long interpreted this as an order of exclusion, created and expanded during a time of Russian weakness. This is not just a phenomenon under Putin. Missed opportunities, choices made and not made, cast a long shadow over European security. This crisis reveals a problem in U.S. strategy. European security remains much more unsettled than it appears. The most militarily powerful state on the continent does not see itself as a stakeholder in Europe's security architecture. There's little evidence that without the United States, European powers can deter Moscow or lead their way out of a major crisis. The European Union is non-existent in the conversation, begging for relevance. Yet, the United States is materially constrained, seeking to focus on the Indo-Pacific and redress a deteriorating military balance vis-a-vis China. Well, all of that definitely sounds, interjecting and editorializing here, like a perfect opportunity for Russia. Washington's dream of making the Russia relationship more predictable via a narrow strategic stability agenda appears to be dissipating. The United States will have to manage China and Russia at the same time for the foreseeable future. For U.S. strategy, it was never going to be China only, but it will prove exceedingly difficult to make it China mostly, not as long as Russia gets a vote. Very, very interesting and helpful analysis by Michael Kaufman. You can follow him on Twitter. He's a director of the Russia Studies program at CNA and a fellow at the Wilson Center Kennan Institute. And we've been reading his article, Putin's wager in Russia's standoff with the West. Thank you to those of you who are here. I have a million other articles lined up that I'd like to go over with you that I have just pulled up and haven't read yet myself. Appreciate you commenting in the chat. There's always an opportunity to hash it out there. If you see something that you like or something that you disagree with in the analysis or in my presentation of it, you can clearly make your voices heard in the chat and in the comments. The war will only happen if Ukraine tries to destroy the people in the Donbass. That may be what's going to trigger it. According to that article, Putin's already had his mind made up. Look at the top rich people from Ukraine and Russia. They have something in common. So the oligarchic analysis, let's say, I can't wait until China and Russia bring down the McDonald's empire. Look, there's a lot at stake in the rules-based international order coming up against the spheres of influence model and the possibility of a Chinese and Russian restructuring. I think Putin wants only Ukraine to send a message that Europe needs Russia for economic reasons. That may be. We've discussed some of the economic reasons. We'll discuss more in this stream, I think, here shortly. Russian attack is a filler in the COVID narrative. Maybe, maybe not. It's Russia's unhappiness with NATO expansion, the whole question of the status of Ukraine, and the multipolar response to a unipolar world did not arise with COVID, as we know. It's a long story. My prediction, if Russia invades Europe, it plays out. Russia annexes all territory east of the Dnieper in less than a week. You see, there's on one hand the strategic plan, on the other hand, as the author suggested, the things that you have to improvise and therefore sometimes unpredictable outcomes. Russia annexes all Ukraine but retreats once Putin realizes this gives Russia a lot more borders with NATO countries. Well, on the other hand, the reordering of the European security architecture is at stake, as we learned from that article. I hope Russian cities like Odessa, etc., will be liberated. Some people may share that perspective. Others may see it differently. So many potential options at play here. We read the articles that come up that I find interesting just based on their title, because I'm reading them with you for the first time. Although that Michael Kaufman, his competence as an analyst, we saw in an earlier stream. So a lot of different comments here. Again, I appreciate you being here. Appreciate the time that you're spending. About Olavo de Carvalho, who had a debate with Dugin in 2011 and who's much beloved by some of his Brazilian students and much hated by his Brazilian opponents. And I don't know how well known he is outside of those circles. May he rest in peace, and my condolences to his family and to his friends. I think he recently had a book of his on Machiavelli published in English. So those of you who want to learn more about Olavo de Carvalho, de Carvalho. He's mentioned in Benjamin Teitelbaum's book, War for Eternity, which also discusses Arctos and Dugin and traditionalism. So pay your respects however you do that. I didn't know him well enough to comment in any great detail, but as I say, beloved by his students and therefore, at the very least, deserves some respect as a teacher. Okay, let's go back to the articles. I hope you don't mind, but that's what we're going to do. Okay. NATO member will withdraw troops in event of war with Russia. With tensions growing on the border between Russia and Ukraine, the Croatian president has announced that Zagreb will pull its troops out of NATO contingents stationed in the region should the situation spiral into a full-scale conflict. Speaking on Tuesday in a televised address, the leader said he sees reports that NATO, not a separate state, not the US, is increasing its presence and sending reconnaissance ships. He insisted that Zagreb's authorities have nothing to do with it, won't have anything to do with it, I guarantee you that. Not only will we not send the military, but if there's an escalation, we will recall every last Croatian military man. This has nothing to do with Ukraine or Russia. It has to do with the dynamics of American domestic politics, Joe Biden and his administration, which I supported. However, the Croatian president pointed out that he sees dangerous behavior in matters of international security. And as you see here, the news about Croatia is really shocking for some people. You can comment on why you think that, whether you agree with, looks like Al Pacino there. The Croatian president pointed out that he sees dangerous behavior in matters of international security. The president's comments come amid high tensions between Moscow and Kiev, with a number of Western leaders sounding the alarm in recent weeks over a purported buildup of Russian forces along the border with Ukraine. We just read about some of the details of that, getting into specific figures. On Monday, the US-led military bloc announced that its membership will order more fleets and fighter planes into the waters of Eastern Europe as Russia continues its military buildup amid the growing row. Spain and France are focusing on southeastern Europe, with Madrid reportedly contemplating dispatching ships to join NATO naval forces and is considering sending fighter jets to Bulgaria. Meanwhile, Paris has expressed its readiness to send troops to Romania under NATO command. Amid accusations in the West of an impending invasion of Ukraine, which the Kremlin has repeatedly denied, Moscow is seeking a written response on its security proposals from American officials following a string of diplomatic meetings this month. We know that background. In December, Russia handed over 2 draft treaties, one for Washington, one for NATO. As well as blocking Kiev from NATO membership, Moscow is insisting the bloc should refrain from military activity on the territory of the former Warsaw Pact states that joined after 1997, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, so you see that was the news from Croatia, the Croatian president saying that his country would stay out of the conflict. Now let's look. Do we have the whole article, or is it behind a paywall? U.S. in talks with energy producers to supply Europe if Russia invades Ukraine. This is Reuters. January 25th. The United States is in talks with major energy producing countries and companies around the world over a potential diversion of supplies to Europe if Russia invades Ukraine, senior Biden administration officials said on Tuesday. Speaking to reporters on a call, the officials did not name the specific countries or companies they were in talks with to ensure an uninterrupted energy flow into Europe for the remainder of the winter, but said they included a broad range of suppliers, including sellers of liquefied natural gas. Reuters reported earlier this month that State Department officials were discussing contingency plans with energy companies to ensure stable supplies to Europe if conflict between Russia and Ukraine disrupted Russian supplies. We've been working to identify volumes of non-Russian natural gas from identify additional volumes of non-Russian natural gas from various areas of the world, from North Africa and the Middle East to Asia and the United States, a senior administration official said on condition of anonymity. Correspondingly, we're in discussions with major natural gas producers around the globe to understand their capacity and willingness to temporarily surge natural gas output and to allocate these volumes to European buyers, the official said. The White House's plan is complicated by the fact that the world's liquefied natural gas producers are already churning out as much as they possibly can. Well, if they're churning out as much as they possibly can, where will they find additional volumes for these contingency plans? I guess that would complicate things. No extra allocation if you're already churning out as much as you possibly can. Reuters reported that the companies contacted told the U.S. government officials that global gas supplies are tight and there's little available to substitute large volumes from Russia. Russia has, we know the details, we know the background. Let's go to the energy crisis. The European Union depends on Russia for around a third of its gas supplies. Any interruptions to Russia's gas supply to Europe would exacerbate an existing energy crisis caused by a shortage. Record power prices have driven up consumer energy bills as well as business costs and sparked protests in some countries. Russia normally supplies 40 billion cubic meters of gas per year to Europe through Ukraine, the senior administration official said, adding that it has already cut those supplies through this route by half. To ensure Europe is able to make it through the winter and spring, we expect to be prepared to ensure alternative supplies covering a significant majority of the potential shortfall. We expect to be prepared to ensure alternative supplies, and yet you have these very serious problems indicated earlier that the producers are already churning out as much as they possibly can. The key to ensuring supplies was also about identifying the locations where the shortfall would be, the official said. The story of Europe is making sure you have access to the right locations in Europe that would be most affected by Russian cutoff of supplies and where storage is lower than other places in Europe. Okay, the energy politics here, something to obviously continue to keep an eye on. U.S. in talks with energy producers to supply Europe if Russia invades Ukraine. Okay. What else? What else? What else? Foggy narratives. This is Amari, January 25th. That's also today. The Western anti-disinfo industry can go hang it. Putin is telling the truth. The US government would like to inform you that Western civilization is not, in fact, collapsing. If you've ever suspected otherwise, viewers of this channel will know. If you've looked around and noticed widespread signs of material and cultural decay, you should seek a narrative reset immediately, because chances are you've fallen victim to a false narrative injected by the Kremlin's disinformation and propaganda ecosystem into the global information environment. That's according to a fact sheet on Russia's top 5 persistent disinformation narratives published last week by the State Department. The document perfectly illustrates how American elites try to deny realities that underscore their misrule while treating the resulting popular discontent as a devious plot hatched by foreign conspirators. Not every point in the fact sheet is flat out wrong, to be sure. It's true that the Kremlin portrays Russia as a perpetual victim, whitewashing Soviet crimes and blaming Western-stoked Russophobia for any and all international hostility toward Moscow, as the document charges. If our ruling class takes, by the way, Russiagate tells you that this whole Russophobia is not just a phantom of our imagination. If our ruling class takes a masochistic pleasure in treating our historical legacy as irredeemably stained, Vladimir Putin and co. tend toward the opposite extreme. But then we get to this doozy. Quote, Russia pushes the false claim that Western civilization has strayed from traditional values. The whole bit is worth quoting at length. The demise of Western civilization is one of Russia's oldest disinformation tropes, with claims of the decaying West documented since the 19th century. This values-based disinformation narrative evokes ill-defined concepts including tradition, family values, and spirituality. Russia argues it is the bastion of so-called traditional values and gender roles, and serves as a moral counterweight to the decadence of the United States and Western countries. For example, President Putin has claimed the West has practically canceled the concepts of mother and father, and instead has replaced them with parent 1 and 2. While Foreign Minister Lavrov wrote that Western students learn at school that Jesus Christ was bisexual. Unquote. This gaslighting is shocking, Amari continues. Let's first unpack the supposed falsehoods here. Have Russian thinkers prophesied doom for the West going back to the 19th century? Sure. So have plenty of Western thinkers of various stripes going back even longer. The revolutionary enormities of the 18th and 19th centuries gave birth to a whole constellation of European thought concerned with the same sense of civilizational crisis. Chateaubriand, Bonald, Maistre, Donoso Cortez, and yes, Dostoevsky are a few of the luminous names. The conservative revolutionaries, reactionaries, and other critics of Western progressivism. And although Marx counted himself a revolutionary, we might as well add his name to the list insofar as he diagnosed the dislocations and miseries brought about by the rise of industrial capitalism and bourgeois liberalism, the same forces against which the reactionaries reacted. No one expects high philosophical insight from the Biden administration. Basic coherence about domestic and foreign affairs would be blessing enough, but it's not disinformation to measure the post-Enlightenment West against the ideals of the classical and Christian civilization that preceded it and to find the modern world wanting. Or was Leo Strauss who gave us the conflict between the ancients and the moderns, the defense of political Platonism, classical political rationalism, and Platonic political philosophy? Was Leo Strauss also Putin's useful idiot? Ridiculous. Are tradition, family values, and spirituality ill-defined concepts? Yes, they are now the predictable consequences of decades, no centuries, of liberal efforts to sever the individual from the natural bonds, inherited obligations, and unchosen communities that used to enclose him and that imbued existence with meaning. It's as stupid as it can be, obviously editorializing here, this is no longer me reading the article here for a moment. It's as stupid as it can be to take everything that's opposed to liberal progressivism, family values, tradition, spirituality, masculinity, femininity, rationality, intelligence, and to project that onto another state like Russia. I mean, for American policy analysts to do this, and then to say that Russia is parroting those ideas or concepts back to the West in a strategic way. In other words, to identify the West with the liberal progressivism that has resulted in its own degradation, and to make any defender of the genuine West, of the decent West, of the civilized West, automatically a pro-Putin Russian useful idiot or stooge, is just as crazy as this article is suggesting. The very term family values is symptomatic of this transformation, since it suggests the natural family is just one among many values or lifestyles the individual might choose in his quest for self-definition. Yeah, the whole language of values is a problem. If you've ever seen Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, he's got a nice chapter on the distinction between values and virtues and what it meant that we gave up the language of virtue or excellence and moved to the language of value or preference. Anyway, back to the article. Next up, are liberals in the United States and Western Europe seeking to overthrow nature and natural law, family, and tradition? Or is that just a Russian narrative? To prove that this is a false Russian narrative, the State Department points to two examples. The first is Putin's warning that Western elites are at war with the very concept of mother and father, which is, I add, of course, perfectly accurate. Last year, House Democrats changed their chamber's standing rules to remove gendered references to father, mother, son, daughter, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, first cousin, nephew, niece, husband, wife, father-in-law, mother-in-law, son-in-law, daughter-in-law, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, stepfather, stepson, stepdaughter, stepbrother, stepsister, half-brother, half-sister, grandson, granddaughter. In place of such oppressive language, the new standing rules substituted, quote, parent, child, sibling, parent, sibling, first cousin, siblings, child, spouse, parent-in-law, child-in-law, sibling-in-law, step-parent, stepchild, step-sibling, half-sibling, not sibling, that's not a word, or grandchild. Even better, the same State Department that published the disinfo fact sheet denying a war on mother and father removed references to mother and father in U.S. passport applications in favor of gender-neutral language a decade ago. And that's not even to mention Western media's relentless celebration of moms with penises and dads without penises. The Western anti-disinfo industry can go hang it. Putin is telling the truth, writes Amari. The truth about liberals in the United States and Western Europe seeking to overthrow nature and natural law, family, and tradition. As for Lavrov's statement that Western educators increasingly frame Jesus Christ as a bisexual or as otherwise LGBTQ, that too is no falsehood. Pressed to defend the foreign minister's claim, the Kremlin pointed to a Scottish Teachers Union's recent decision to stage the Gospel According to Jesus, Queen of Heaven, by Joe Clifford, a man who identifies as a woman, and reimagines Jesus as a trans woman, as Christianity Today reported. The Russians might also have mentioned Holy Cross theologian, named here, whose scholarship speculates that, quote, Jesus of Nazareth may, in some New Testament writings, be seen as a feminine figure, and in other writings may be best read as a drag king with queer desires, according to Inside Higher Ed. Liberals and Nato jingoists can't have it both ways. To defend such blasphemous subversion as a shining example of what makes our societies so wonderfully free, and simultaneously deny that it takes place at all. The more disturbing point is the apparent addiction of US and Western elites, including those at Foggy Bottom, to conspiracy theories. For that is what we're ultimately dealing with here, a kind of middle brow conspiracy theory designed to shield Western power centers from criticism from below. If the common people, vast swaths of their own populations, are unhappy with today's economic, cultural, and political arrangements, it must be because they're Kremlin agents or unwitting Kremlin dupes, not because they are badly governed. Why did a decisive majority of British voters choose to exit the European Union in 2016? Because the Russians fooled them, not because the EU project served globalist interests, while leaving many working and middle class people behind? Why did the voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin cast their lot with Donald Trump the same year? It was because of Russian Facebook memes, and not because the reality TV host spoke to their anxieties over immigration and working class jobs and wages. What triggered the rage of France's yellow vests in 2018? You guessed it, it was Russian disinformation, not President Emmanuel Macron's high-handed green policies that jacked up gas prices for rural and working class people. Why do many people in the West feel as if civilization itself is collapsing, that they're being plunged into dystopia? Don't blame the material inequality, the inflation, the riots, the iconoclasm, the critical race theory, the gender madness, the permanent COVID regime, but blame the troll farms of St. Petersburg. Great article, Amari, contributing editor of The American Conservative and a visiting fellow of the Veritas Center of Ethics and Public Life at Franciscan University. Foggy narratives that Western anti-disinfo industry can go hang it, Putin's telling the truth. And here's what he was referring to. Department of State, Russia's top 5 persistent disinformation narratives, fact sheet, Office of the Spokesperson, January 20th, 2022. Russia has fabricated a set of false narratives over the years that its disinformation and propaganda ecosystem persistently injects into the global information environment. I'm sure they think that this channel is part of that. These narratives act like a template which enables the Kremlin to adjust these narratives with one consistency: a complete disregard for truth as it shapes the information environment to support its policy goals. What is truth? State Department has some very strong thoughts on the truth of whether Western civilization is in a state of degradation or not, moral, cultural, civilizational, whether it needs a return to its roots, to the classics, to Plato, to the Bible, maybe another beginning of philosophy. Yeah, I'm sure the State Department has very strong thoughts on the truth of all of that. But let's see, Russian military and intelligence entities. By the way, it's not easy to think about the truth of civilizational history, but the nature of civilization's birth, life, and death, the cycles, if you're a cyclical thinker, about nature, essence, law, time, reason, the good life, the good regime. These are difficult questions. And whenever there's a criticism of liberal progressivism with its race ideology, gender ideology, attack on decent education, attack on the classics, and all of that, you don't just want to assume that it's a foreign propaganda operation. Russian military and intelligence entities are engaging in this activity across Russia's disinformation propaganda ecosystem, to include malign social media operations, the use of overt and covert online proxy media outlets, injection of disinfo into TV and radio programming, hosting of conferences, etc., to influence attendees into falsely believing that Ukraine, not Russia, is at fault for heightened tensions in the region, and the leveraging of cyber operations to deface media outlets and conduct hack and release operations, all of which, by the way, I'm sure is also happening. We're not denying that these kinds of things happen, but we're denying that anybody in the West who believes there's been a post-Enlightenment war on the ideals of classical and Christian civilization, anybody who's following the battle between the ancients and the moderns and that kind of thing, we deny that that's automatically, like it is now in the mainstream, to be attributed to Russian disinformation campaigns and things like that. I mean, sometimes maybe it is, but disambiguation is the name of the game. Here are 5 major recurring Russian disinformation themes the Kremlin's currently readjusting in an attempt to fill the info environment with false narratives about its actions in Ukraine. 1, Russia's an innocent victim. 2, historical revisionism. We can read some of these. How far? I think it's been almost at the 1 hour mark. Collapse of Western civilization is imminent. This is the one that the previous article was looking at. Russia pushing the false claim that Western civilization is collapsing. Is this a false claim? Is Western civilization collapsing? What is Western civilization? Did it collapse a long time ago? Is it collapsing and being rebuilt? Is it just getting started? Is this a false claim? What is the claim even saying? Has the West strayed from traditional values? I mean, aren't these questions somehow self-evident to people who don't even know anything about Putin or Russia? Has the West strayed from traditional values? So, Russian propaganda. And we just read a nice article about that. Popular movements are US-sponsored color revolutions. The Kremlin has difficulty accepting. Now, this is actually kind of funny if we put 3 and 4 together. The Kremlin has difficulty accepting that all individuals should have the human right to freedom of expression and that government should be held accountable to its people. Russia has therefore accused the United States of either instigating uprisings or plotting color revolutions in Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz Republic, Moldova, Ukraine, and throughout the Middle East and Africa. That's true. If a popular movement is pro-democracy and pro-reform and is not deemed to be in Russia's geopolitical interests, the Kremlin will often attack its legitimacy and claim that the United States is secretly behind it. Look how beautiful it is. If we combine theme 4 and theme 3. Russia claims that the United States is secretly behind any popular movement that's pro-democracy and pro-reform. And the United States, implicitly, acts as though if a popular movement is pro-tradition, pro-family, pro-civilization, pro-culture, pro-decency, pro-intelligence, pro-competence, and all of that kind of thing, pro-nature in the sense of natural rights or natural law, and not deemed to be in America's geopolitical interests, then the White House says that it's Russia secretly behind it. This is all very normal, all very natural. We just need to think beneath the surface of things. These baseless accusations often target local and international civil society organizations. By the way, in politics, paradoxes can be true and contradictions can be true. So it's both and, you know, there can be, it can be accurate that Russia pushes the claim that Western civilization is collapsing, and it can be accurate that Western civilization is collapsing and that people who think so have nothing to do with Putin. And it can be accurate that popular movements are in some cases US-sponsored color revolutions and other cases that they're not. And that everybody's doing what they can do to defend their own geopolitical interests with whatever narrative will serve that. I mean, that's somehow 101, that would be happening in international relations. The philosophical questions, the theoretical questions, all the other kinds of questions, the comparative ideological analysis and everything, that's a level deeper, but should be no surprise that any of that's happening. Theme 5, reality is whatever the Kremlin wants it to be. Like socially constructed, or what does this mean? Reality is whatever the Kremlin wants it to be. The Kremlin frequently tries to create multiple false realities and inserts confusions into the information environment when the truth is not in its interests. Again, so the nature of social and political truth, the nature of how an interpretation about the meaning of history can be true or false, these are actually, I'm not even taking issue. I mean, you don't expect the State Department release to be going into the philosophy of being in time. But those of us who are reading it, looking at it, thinking about it, should always know that the nature of interpreting the meaning of historical truth, what's the truth about when civilization is collapsing or not? When one side thinks it's progressing and the other thinks it's regressing. Often intentionally confusing, Russian officials make arguments designed to try to shift the blame away from the Russian government's role, even if some of the narratives contradict one another. Good thing for everybody outside of Russia that only happens in Russia. However, in time, presenting multiple conflicting narratives can itself become a technique intended to generate confusion and discourage response. Can you think of any examples outside of Russia propaganda where presenting multiple conflicting narratives was a technique intended to generate confusion and discourage response? Curious to know. You could leave that in the chat or comments. Other elements in Russia's disinfo and propaganda ecosystem, such as the abuse of state-funded disinformation outlets and weaponized social media, help push multiple false narratives. It was clear to the world, for example, that Russia attempted to assassinate former Russian military intelligence officer Skripal, I guess, and his daughter Yulia with the nerve agent Novichok in Salisbury, England on March 4th, 2018. Who did what, where, when, and why? In the 4 weeks following that incident, Russian state-funded and directed outlets RT and Sputnik disseminated 138 separate and contradictory narratives via 735 articles, according to the Policy Institute at King's College London. Well, Russia has used the same technique of flooding the information space with many false claims following other events. I can't remember where I heard it recently. Maybe it was when Elon Musk was on Lex Fridman's podcast, or maybe it was when somebody was on Joe Rogan's podcast, which I think is actually more likely, that the question came up about artificially artificial intelligence generated information space false narratives that get spread by artificial intelligence information warrior bots, so that you have AI produced info being spread by AI. You get it, right? Where the technique of flooding is basically self-generating, self-sustaining. So definitely the info space and the info wars in it are a thing, indisputably. Well, okay, the purpose is to confuse and distract others and manipulate the truth to suit Kremlin interests. This was this Russia's top 5 persistent disinfo narratives document released a couple of days ago, because it was referred to in this polemical editorial by Amari. Putin is telling the truth, namely about the degenerate state of Western civilization and the decadent effects of liberal progressivism. Okay, got those two out of the way. I kind of want to stop this stream shortly. Let's see what else I had up. 60,000 US troops based in Europe that Biden can use to defend Ukraine against Russia, with more US-based troops on standby to deploy. And Biden has placed USS Harry S. Truman under NATO control. Is this long? Okay, fine. Let's keep going. By the way, thanks to those who are here. Always great to see you. You know what I mean? Always great to be with you. As Putin continues to stoke fears he'll invade, the U.S. may have to ready its cache of cache of arms in Europe, including 40 warships, 175 aircraft, 90 tanks. Let's skip the bullet points, go to the article. Nearly 64,000 U.S. troops stationed in Europe could be deployed to the continent's eastern flank if President Biden makes such a call to counter growing Russian aggression at the border with Ukraine. The USS Harry S. Truman has already been placed under NATO command for the first time since the end of the Cold War, while 40 ships, 175 aircraft, and 90 tanks situated throughout Europe could also be readied for conflict. Biden has ordered 8,500 US-based troops to stand ready to deploy to Eastern Europe, while military officials have presented him with a plan to send 50,000 more if the security situation deteriorates and Russia launches an invasion into Ukraine. At the same time, the U.S. told families based at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev to go home due to the continued threat of such an attack, the State Department said Sunday. Though the number fluctuates due to changing withdrawals and deployments, the U.S. had about 175,000 troops stationed abroad as of September 2021. A total of nearly 64,000 of these service members were stationed in Europe. The U.S. has about 750 military bases across 80 countries. Command for the U.S.'s 40 warships is based out of Italy, and the U.S. has already flexed its muscle to Russia by sending ships to the politically fraught Black Sea. Germany houses the largest deployment of U.S. troops in Europe, and only Japan and America have more U.S. troops based there. There are 35,468 U.S. troops in Germany, 21,585 Army, 13,009 Air Force, and small number of troops from the Marine Corps and Navy. As the imminent threat of war looms over Europe, it comes as the USS Harry S. Truman and its strike group will participate in a NATO exercise in the Mediterranean until February 4th. Biden said he and European leaders had total unanimity about the situation in Ukraine. As we've read in our recent live streams, at least Germany has some exceptions to U.S. sanctions regime ideas because of the energy politics. The White House said NATO has emphasized a desire for a diplomatic solution. Putin discussed the strategic partnership with Cuba in a phone call with their president days after fears were raised that Russia would deploy military to South America. The U.S. and UK have begun withdrawing diplomats from their embassies in Kiev. And as we see in this image, what do we see in this image? United Kingdom. Troops largely from the U.S. Air Force. Okay, these are U.S. troop deployments. Okay, U.S. troop deployments. That's what's shown here. 35,000 U.S. troops in Germany, almost 10,000 in the U.K., over 12,000 in Italy. Romania, Hungary, Poland. Okay, theater. Oops, what else do we have here? USS Harry S. Truman placed under NATO command for the first time since the end of the Cold War. Let's see. Running out of steam for the stream. How's everybody doing? Should we finish this article at least? There are 21 military bases across Germany, with the largest presence at Stuttgart, headquarters of the U.S. European Command and U.S. Africa Command, and Ramstein, headquarters of U.S. Air Force operations in Europe. And while Germany previously housed some 5,000 U.S. tanks in the height of the Cold War in 1989, it's now permanent home to none. No U.S. tanks. The Army temporarily deploys one armored brigade at a time, each on a 9-month rotation. A typical armored brigade is made up of 90 M1 tanks and 130 Bradley fighting vehicles, plus around 18 M109 self-propelled howitzers. But there remains a problem. Europe's aging brigades may not be ready for the 68-ton M1 Abrams tanks. The Army's been struggling to purchase more armored bridge layers to help these heavy vehicles pass. The M1 Abrams has been in use in war zones since 1980, while the Bradley fighting vehicle is a heavily armed and armored troop transporter that launches fire toward enemy lines to provide cover. The howitzer is a 30-ton gun that can hit targets up to 19 miles away. And while NATO has a presence of about 130 tanks, including the 90 U.S. vehicles, Russia, even before its recent aggression, kept about 760 tanks within striking distance of NATO's Baltic members. Ukraine shares a border with 4 NATO countries: Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Italy has the second highest U.S. presence in Europe, with 12,000, just 12,500 troops, as we just saw, 4,000 belonging to the Army, almost 5 Air Force, and 3.5 Navy. The Naples port is the headquarters of the 6th Fleet, or U.S. Naval Forces Europe-Africa. Aviano Air Base. Okay, we're not going to get into all of the weeds here about who's located where. Obviously, it's information that is relevant, but I don't want to read it out to you on the stream. U.S. troops in European countries. Again, you see it summarized here: Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and Coast Guard in Germany, Italy, Greece, and the UK, as well as Netherlands, Spain, Poland, Romania, Belgium, Norway. So you see anybody looking for this kind of information, this is going to be an article you may want to have a look at on your own. Italy was the second highest, right after Germany. Yeah, 35,000, 12,000, and then almost 10 in the UK. Who's got the least here? Norway. Oh, Hungary. While the U.S. intends to move its military trainers out of Ukraine swiftly should a full-scale Russian invasion occur, which, as we saw, at least Michael Kaufman was predicting it would, it's also possible some American forces could stay to advise Kiev officials and provide frontline support, a U.S. official told the Times. However, roughly 6,000 U.S. troops are deployed to Eastern Europe on a rotating basis, including about 4,000 currently in Poland. Okay, troop numbers could be increased. Biden administration ordering more U.S.-based troops to stand ready to deploy to Eastern Europe, the Pentagon reported yesterday. Pictured here, M1 Abrams, F-16, and Russian rocket launcher. Okay, troops, the numbers, who's going to be stationed where, everybody getting ready and everybody gearing up. What does this show us? Drills, Russian troop positions, Russian naval activity, and NATO members, Russian troops along the Ukrainian border. Okay, those of you who really want to get into details, not just is it going to happen, when is it going to happen, how's it going to happen, what might be the outcomes, you probably will want to know where are troops stationed, what's the balance of forces, what are the possible exact kinds of operations to expect, who's doing what where. Russian Black Sea Fleet based in Sevastopol, Russia to stage live fire war games 150 miles south West Ireland in February. Denmark sending forces to the Baltic Sea, ready to dispatch fighter jets to Lithuania. Spain deploying ships to join NATO. France willing to send troops to Romania. Netherlands planning to send fighters to Bulgaria. Okay. A lot of updates on forces being moved into a state of readiness. 8,500 US-based troops to be on standby to deploy. And the USS Harry S. Truman under NATO control for the first time since the end of the Cold War. Another article I probably will not read here today on Transnistria, Pridnestrovia. Those of you who know about this pro-Russian breakaway state. Interesting, but maybe I'll leave that for another stream. The Ukraine case through a Russian perspective, probably leave that for the next one. Ukraine leaders tell the nation that Russian invasion is not imminent as world leaders prepare for potential escalation. We saw an article already about that mixed messaging in a way, their apparent urgency coming out of the American messaging and the comparative calm. I think that was in the Michael Kaufman article. The strange tone of apparent calm from Ukraine's leaders who made that joke about Kiev being safer than Los Angeles. And then this thread, Russia's potential capture of this Ukrainian firm resolves numerous problems for both Russia and China. A thread here from 2019 about about a company of interest to Russia and China in Ukraine. Looks like this could be an important thread for us to consider, but you know what? We've been together for quite some time, and I appreciate all of you being here. Let me just put some chat comments on the screen, and then we'll part ways. For now, let's see where we stopped. I'll just go to some arbitrary point here. You can look at the chat. You can be active in the chat, in the comments. I always want to give you a chance to see yourselves on screen, interact with one another. I appreciate very much you being here and taking the time. Yeah, I'll just put this one up here again. Not that. Is that not coming up? Okay, let's do this differently. There you go. Rest in peace, Olavo de Carvalho, 1947-2022. I don't know his works well, but many of his students say he was a great teacher, very important in their lives. And you can read about him in Benjamin Teitelbaum's book, War for Eternity, about Bannon and traditionalism. It's worth reading. You'll learn more about Olavo, as well as about Dugin, Arctos, and some other thinkers and figures. Okay, everybody, thanks so much for your time. Like, subscribe, share, do all of those kinds of things. Millerman School is where I teach political philosophy courses on Carl Schmitt, Alexander Dugin, Martin Heidegger, Plato, Leo Strauss, and others. I'll be adding courses there. I have all kinds of new projects coming up in and out of the school. I may stream later again today, otherwise tomorrow. Thanks for being here. Be well, be healthy, stay safe. Goodbye.